Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to move that the Fiscal Management and Accountability Amendment Bill 2021, Bill number 1, 2021, published on the 27th of January 2021, be now read a second time. Mr. Speaker, this bill, the Fiscal Management and Accountability Amendment Bill, is in fact, at one level, an extremely simple bill. It seeks to enact a few amendments to the Principal Act, the FMAA as it is now popularly known. And these amendments are designed to streamline the budget process, and to increase its efficiency, and to improve the effectiveness with which Parliament can consider the budgets of these entities. And so, Mr. Speaker, it is indeed my expectation that this amendment bill will enjoy swift and smooth passage through the House and unanimous support on both sides of the House. Mr. Speaker, it will be recalled that the FMAA, when it was first introduced in the National Assembly in 2003, represented a vast and comprehensive piece of legislation intended to overhaul the fiscal management architecture of the country, repealing and replacing, as it did at that time, the Financial Administration and Audit Act that we had inherited from colonial times, and which, though it had served an extremely useful purpose over the years, had outlived by then its usefulness and its relevance to modern financial management practices worldwide. And so the FMA was introduced, like I said, comprising a comprehensive architecture, legislative architecture, to govern the entire budget process, from budget preparation to budget execution to ex post reporting and accountability arrangements. And that new act, brought into law in 2003, served our country well for many years, and has often been cited by members on both sides of this House, sitting in our respective places, indeed on both sides, in successive parliaments, demonstrating its utility and its value and its sustained relevance as it relates to the management and accountability of public money. The particular amendments that we are moving today relate to certain provisions that were inserted into the Principal Act in 2015, shortly after the change in administration. In 2015, I believe it may have been in June or July of 2015, shortly after our colleagues on the opposite side of the House would then have assumed government, the then government brought to the National Assembly an amendment bill to amend the original FMA. And that amendment bill related to the budget process that was to govern constitutional agencies, as they were then described, and in particular, constitutional agencies. The term constitutional agencies was interpreted to mean, although not defined in the FMA amendment at the time, the term constitutional agencies was interpreted to mean those agencies listed, those entities listed in the third schedule to the Constitution. There was, in fact, a companion bill, a Constitution amendment bill, that sought indeed to expand the list of those agencies reflected in the third schedule. The intent stated at the time, the intent of the FMA amendment bill was, the stated intent was to give effect to Article 222A of the Constitution, which relates to the financial autonomy of the said constitutional entities. And the then amendment articulated a two-stage process whereby the budgets of constitutional agencies would be brought to the National Assembly, considered by the Assembly and approved, and then incorporated into the national budget, which would subsequently be submitted to the House for consideration, at which time the budgets of the constitutional agencies which had been so incorporated would not be reconsidered by the House, but would simply form part of the annual budget. It might be worthwhile to note, Mr. Speaker, that the 2015 amendment represented, in fact, the second time that the APNU-AFC had sought to introduce this amendment, the previous occasion being one that preceded their assumption of government, during, I believe, that would have been the 10th Parliament. On that occasion, the FMA amendment bill did not receive the benefit of presidential assent, and for very good reason, and reasons which, Mr. Speaker, I will shortly elaborate on. Mr. Speaker, while the intent to give effect to Article 222A is perhaps one worthy of commendation, the process that was articulated in the FMA amendment bill, instead of giving effect to the said article, had in fact the result of colliding with certain critical aspects of that article, and colliding in a manner that rendered, in fact, the process of this Assembly's consideration of the national budget convoluted, complicated, and in fact problematic. And I will cite at least one significant example in this regard. And so, Mr. Speaker, while the amendment that we are now bringing to the House seeks very simply to remove this two-step process that involves the prior submission of the budgets of the constitutional agency, to remove this two-step process, or to combine these two processes into a single submission of the National Assembly for reasons that I will elaborate shortly. And so, on that basis, constitutes a very simple amendment and very intuitive amendment. The bill, in fact, addresses issues that are very fundamental as well. And I wish, Mr. Speaker, to highlight a couple of these very fundamental issues that the bill seeks to address. First of all, Mr. Speaker, it is a well-established principle, both in our Constitution and indeed in the traditions of our Parliament and in parliaments like ours, that certain responsibilities as they relate to fiscal matters are vested in the executive. And this perhaps is best exemplified, Mr. Speaker, by Article 171 of the Constitution, which clearly articulates that certain matters relating to the public finances, including the levying of any taxes, or the incurrence of any expenditure, or the causing of any charge against the consolidated fund, that those matters can only be brought before this House with the prior consent of Cabinet signified by a minister. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, this article of the Constitution refers not only to bills, but even to motions. And it specifically says that the Parliament, the National Assembly, shall not proceed on any bill or motion for imposing or increasing any tax, for imposing any charge upon the consolidated fund or any other public fund of Guyana, or for altering any such charge, for the payment, issue, or withdrawal from the consolidated fund or any other public fund of Guyana, of any monies not charged thereon, or any increase in the payment of any increase in the amount of any such payment, etc., for compounding and remitting any debt, etc. That such matters, whether bill or motion, shall not be proceeded upon by this Assembly except on the recommendation and with the consent of the Cabinet. This particular article, Mr. Speaker, is in fact replicated in the standing orders of our own August Assembly, reinforcing the role of the executive in matters relating to public finances, and with good reason. Because as long as we will hold the executive accountable for fiscal outcomes, then the executive must, of necessity, have an appropriate role to play as it relates to fiscal matters. Later today, Mr. Speaker, we will be debating two orders relating, or two motions seeking to confirm orders relating to the public debt of Guyana, domestic and external. Compliance with the ceilings prescribed by those two orders is the responsibility of the incumbent government. And to the extent that the incumbent government is responsible for managing the fiscal affairs of the country, to ensure compliance with those ceilings, the ceilings prescribed therein, it behoves the incumbent government to manage all of the operations that affect the public finances to ensure compliance with those laws. And so, Mr. Speaker, the principle regarding the involvement of the executive as it relates to matters in finance is in fact very well established, like I said, in parliaments similar to ours across the world. What the 2015 amendment sought to do, and in fact did once enacted, was to curtail and diminish the executive's role. And in fact, those budgets no longer came to the National Assembly submitted by the Minister of Finance, or the Minister responsible for finance, or with the prior signification of consent of Cabinet as is required by our Constitution, but instead were submitted through the offices of the Clerk of the National Assembly. And of course, with no respect whatsoever intended to the distinguished Clerk of the National Assembly, the function of managing the public finances, the function of ensuring compliance with any ceilings, whether on debt or any other fiscal ceiling, the function of ensuring the achievement of fiscal outcomes rests with the minister responsible for finance and the government of which he or she is a part. And so, Mr. Speaker, that 2015 amendment violated that cardinal principle that required the executive's involvement in the management of the public finances. The underlying principle, Mr. Speaker, is that if we will hold the executive accountable for the achievement of fiscal outcomes, then the executive must be clothed with suitable authority to ensure the achievement of those outcomes. Otherwise, Mr. Speaker, if we want to carve out a part of the budget and remove the executive from involvement in consideration of that part of the budget, then we need to exclude that part of the budget from any ceiling that would be applicable to the fiscal outcomes for which the executive is responsible. But that, of course, was not done. But secondly, Mr. Speaker, and equally fundamentally, the language of Article 222A was very clear, sufficiently clear that I believe it would be obvious to all of us what the intent of the framers of this article was. Article 222A says, in order to assure the independence of the entities listed in the third schedule, the expenditure of each of the entities shall be financed as a direct charge on the consolidated fund, determined as a lump sum by way of an annual subvention approved by the National Assembly, after a review and approval of the entity's annual budget as a part of the process of determination of the national budget, of the determination of the national budget. And I want, Mr. Speaker, to repeat that particular part of the article for emphasis. After a review and approval of the entity's annual budget as a part of the process of the determination of the national budget. And we might, Mr. Speaker, ask ourselves, why did the framers of Article 222A, which was inserted in our Constitution in our 2001 constitutional amendments, following the comprehensive constitutional reform process that we all took part in, why did the framers of that particular article go to the lengths and take the pains to specify that language that required the approval of the budgets of the constitutional agencies to be a part of the process of the determination of the national budget? The insertion of that language, Mr. Speaker, was not an accident. It was, in fact, very deliberate, and very deliberate for the following reasons. A cardinal principle of sound fiscal management is unity and comprehensiveness. When one is examining the national budget and considering how various allocations will impact on the macroeconomy, on fiscal outcomes, it is unavoidably necessary that one should consider the budget in its entirety. The budget, after all, Mr. Speaker, is a process of prioritization. It's a process by which means a range of competing calls on the public treasury, typically all very, or more often than not, all very legitimate calls on the public treasury, but a wide range of competing calls on the public treasury are considered amongst each other. And a process of prioritization is undertaken in order to achieve an outcome that optimally allocates the finite fiscal resources that are available to the country across these competing needs. And unavoidably, Mr. Speaker, some agencies will not get what they request. Many agencies have vast and ambitious and very legitimate plans for rolling out their agendas for developing their respective sectors. And here indeed, Mr. Speaker, I speak equally to many of my colleagues on this side of it, many of whom, were there not to be a fiscal constraint, would have very ambitious plans to transform their respective sectors. But, Mr. Speaker, we as a government, and indeed this assembly, in considering the national budget, must have a view of the entirety of the national budget, must have a view, a comprehensive view. Otherwise, Mr. Speaker, this assembly is being asked to consider and approve a part of the budget in isolation from all of the other competing calls on the public treasury. And this is an important issue. And it is an issue that has arisen in this very House over the course of the last 5 years. And I will cite just one of many examples. Imagine, Mr. Speaker, that we are coming to this House and asking this House to approve the budgets of a long list of entities carved out of the national budget, extracted from the totality of all budgetary calls in this country, presenting this carved out part of the budget and saying to the House that in isolation of what else is happening in the economy, in isolation of what else is happening in the economy, we are asking you to approve these budgets, irrespective of what is expected to happen with growth in the economy, irrespective of what is happening with respect to revenue in the economy, irrespective of what is happening with respect to other calls on the budget. We ask the National Assembly, we carve out this subset of the budget and we say, we are presenting this to the National Assembly and we're asking that you blindly, because you don't have a view of the rest of the public finances, that you blindedly or blindfoldedly approve this part of the budget, irrespective of how it fits within the broader fiscal framework. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, it will be recalled that the 2015 amendment required the Minister of Finance to submit his comments. And, Mr. Speaker, I will give just one example of what was submitted by my predecessor in office, by way of comments, to support the recommendation that he was making. And I quote, and this is the document that was circulated to this House requesting approval of the recommendations of the executive. And it was the recommendations of the executive that was brought for approval and ultimately that were approved. This, Mr. Speaker, is the comment of the Ministry of Finance, my predecessor, that was put before this House. Recommended allocation is made in the context of existing fiscal space and the consideration of the agency's request within national development priorities. End of quote. And this assembly was asked to approve these budgets without a picture of what this fiscal framework was all about, without a picture of what revenue developments would look like, without a picture of what the anticipated growth in the economy would be. And so indeed, Mr. Speaker, it would be fair to say that this House was really being asked to approve these budgets blindly. This fact, Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to say, was not lost on my colleagues on this side of the House, who at that time were sitting on the opposite side of the House. And I quote, Mr. Speaker, from the debate on the 2018 budget, but you see this trend every year. I quote from the 2018, the debate on the 2018 budget, from my distinguished colleague, the Honorable Minister Teixeira, then the Honorable Member Gail Teixeira, who said as follows. The Honorable Member said at the time, when the Fiscal Management and Accountability Act was amended in 2005, and we started this process of having the constitutional bodies dealt with separately, we did this before the Minister's budget presentation. That's very important. So the full set of fiscal projections had not come to the House. The revenue projections had not come to the House, and the Honourable Member correctly identified this and said as follows. We did this before the Minister's budget presentation. It was not as clear last year as it is now, in the sense that the Minister has written in the legend, as he has just said, that the macroeconomic outlook, projections for revenues and borrowing and sustainability of these have led to the cuts. And here, Mr. Speaker, is the operative part of the quote. The Honourable Member, and now Minister Teixeira, said, very importantly, and I quote again, but the problem is that we do not know what his macroeconomic outlook is. We do not know what the projections for revenues are. We do not know what the projections for borrowing are. We have a media report of July which was circulated in the House, and the Minister is not saying it, but I would say it for him. The performance is abysmally bad. It's dismal, but the Minister has not said that the outlook is absolutely dismal. But we do not know what his macroeconomic outlook is. We do not know what projected revenues are. But yet, Mr. Speaker, this House was being asked to approve these budgets without having access to this absolutely critical information. Critical to assess affordability and capacity to pay, critical to assess relative competing priorities, critical to assessing the entirety of the budget. And this, Mr. Speaker, shouldn't come as a surprise to us, because, like I said earlier, it has been a long-standing and well-established principle that in presenting budgets to the National Assembly, they should be presented comprehensively. The National Assembly, if it is to consider the budget in a meaningful manner, must have a complete picture of all of the public finances, of the revenues of government, of the projected expenditures of the whole of government, and how these will be financed. And so, Mr. Speaker, that 2015 amendment to the FMA had, in fact, a number of perverse consequences. First of all, like I said, it excluded the executive and required now for financial matters to be brought before this House by a route other than that required by the Constitution, which is a route that requires the prior consent of the Cabinet, as is required in Article 171 of the Constitution. It also had the perverse result that the Assembly was denied a complete picture and was instead being asked to pronounce on matters with only a very partial picture of the public finance. Mr. Speaker, in the interest of remedying and curing those significant defects, we have brought this 2021 amendment to the FMA to ensure that this Assembly is presented with a complete picture, to ensure that when we bring the national budget to the Parliament, and when the Parliament is asked to vote on items, that the Parliament receives the whole of the budget, including the constitutional agency. I hasten to emphasize, Mr. Speaker, I hasten to emphasize that in proposing these amendments, we are careful to preserve those provisions that are in fact required by Article 221A. In fact, first of all, I should say that what this amendment does is it corrects what has transpired over the last 5 years in violation of Article 222, which explicitly requires that the budgets of the constitutional agencies be considered as part.
Bye, Daddy.
It corrects the fact, Mr. Speaker, that whereas the Constitution requires, 222A, paragraph A, requires that the budgets of these constitutional agencies be considered as a part of the process of the determination of the annual budget, that instead did not happen because of the 2015 amendments that were introduced. So our amendments seek to correct this. I wish, Mr. Speaker, like I said earlier, to emphasize that we preserve in the FMA those provisions that require that the budget be voted as an annual subvention approved by the National Assembly. So you will note that that requirement is preserved. And indeed the requirement, the provision that ensures that the budget is made available to these constitutional agencies in a lump sum to manage as they deem fit immediately after the budget is approved as a lump sum. Those provisions, Mr. Speaker, we have preserved, thereby ensuring that the intent, the letter and intent of Article 222A as it relates to the financial autonomy of those constitutional agencies, that autonomy is preserved and remains, or indeed that is preserved and is made good. And so, Mr. Speaker, we believe that the FMA amendment bill currently before the House will result in a budget process that will be far more meaningful than has obtained over the course of the last 5 years. It will ensure that this House makes better informed decisions. And ultimately, Mr. Speaker, we expect that it will ensure that that our country is better able to realize the fiscal outcomes that we aspire to achieve. I don't wish, Mr. Speaker, to speculate. We will come back to the matter of debt later in the day. And I don't wish, Mr. Speaker, to speculate on whether it was this carving out and carving up of the budget that resulted in the suboptimal fiscal outcomes that arose, including the accumulation of the vast overdraft that we will speak about later. But we would like, Mr. Speaker, to correct and fix this matter. Hence the amendment bill that we now propose. I conclude, Mr. Speaker, by emphasizing that nothing in this bill affects the financial autonomy that will be enjoyed by the constitutional agents. And that's very important. Absolutely nothing in this bill will affect or influence the financial autonomy of these constitutional agents. And Mr. Speaker, with those words, Mr. Speaker, repeat for emphasis, absolutely nothing in this bill affects the financial autonomy that is enjoyed by the agencies listed in the third schedule of the Constitution. With those words, Mr. Speaker, it gives me great pleasure to commend the Fiscal Management and Accountability Amendment Bill 2021 to this Honourable House, and at the appropriate moment, Mr. Speaker, I will invite my colleagues in the House to vote in favour of its smooth passage. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister.